Welcome back again. So in this video we're looking at delegated legislation. On the screen is a UK website which could give you some deeper understanding, but it's not necessary for this particular assignment. The heading, "The Devil is in the Detail," is very descriptive of delegated legislation. It's where we find a great deal of detail in our law. There are more delegated legislation examples than there are statutes. So it's a very important business issue. So let's move forward to the assignment. And you're required to explain what delegated legislation is, the types of legislation, and when this can be challenged in court for 10 marks. Now this can be quite challenging, so I'll run through these issues. And remember, it's 10 marks. You're filling in the grid, so you are not going into this in a great deal of depth. You need to find an example of delegated legislation that applies to your business, and we'll look at that, and that would be relatively easy to do. Identify the Empowering Act and a simple set of facts to show when it might apply to your business. So this is a fairly straightforward process, certainly much simpler than the first part of the assignment. So let's start with what we mean by delegated legislation, and we've talked through this in class, so this will be a quick repeat. If you have questions, put them on the discussion board so that I can see them quickly and respond to everyone. Now, what do we mean? We need an empowering act. So delegation is the passing of power to another person to conduct some action. And Parliament does that, like it does everything, by passing a statute. And in the statute, it gives this power to somebody else to do something, generally to fill in details. Regulations describe those pieces of delegated legislation made by the Governor-General by order in Council. The Council is the Executive Council, which is Cabinet, which are the ministers responsible for government departments. So collectively, the ministers together and the Governor-General make up the Executive Council, and it is a common practice to give power to the Executive Council to make regulations. The practical process is, for example, we need new plumbing regulations that would affect my business plan. The government department concerned, which would be Department of Building and Housing, would get together all the experts and it would draft up these new rules, which might be rules on the sizes of pipes, how water is reticulated, pressures, just the very detailed things that plumbers would do. They'd write them up as a new set of rules. This would go to the Executive Council and they would agree to those and pass them as an order in council, and those would be our new plumbing regulations. So it's very fast, it's very good for very technical areas which Parliament, meaning the ministers, members of Parliament, are unlikely to either understand or have the time to work through in detail. So it's a very efficient way to make detailed rules for the conducting of business, and it's very, very common. Others which make regulations might be ministers, might be government departments. There is a large raft of these which are referred to as tertiary regulations. And we're not going to be too concerned in here, but you need to be aware of them, that ministers can make rules, regulations, standards. It should be standards, not standards. The other one to consider are councils, meaning the local council, such as the Auckland City Council. Their Empowering Act is a local government act, and it gives them the power to make delegated legislation, which you will have seen if you've seen the introductory video for this course, which covers this particular area as well. So let's move on to some notes on what you really need to do. So explain the delegation process, what delegation means to you. Identify how Parliament delegates and its powers to acts, and then the three main types. So work through that. Now, the real issue here is going to be talking about controls. So how is this controlled? And there's two major areas. Parliament itself controls it, and the courts can control it. So let's just start with the general power of courts to control orders in council. And this uses this idea of ultra vires. And the term ultra vires literally means beyond the power. So when Parliament gives its power to a person or group to make delegated legislation, they give a reason. So if they make regulations within that reason, then that's lawful. If they make regulations which are outside the reason, they're outside the delegated power, and we call this ultra vires. Vires simply means power, ultra is outside of. Now, the other one we're looking at first, Legislation Act 2012. Now, this is covered in the legislation, and I'll just run through to this. Legislation Act 2012, and in it, it has a process as we go down through here in Part 3, subordinate legislation, meaning lower disallowable instruments. Now, this is about disallowance, and this is what we're talking about as one of the controls. Disallowance of instruments by resolution of the House of Representatives. So when a new regulation is made, these have to be brought before Parliament within 28 days, and Parliament can have a simple vote, and as you can see here, may by resolution, which is the vote, disallow any disallowable instrument, which means they can disallow any resolution by a simple vote and say it shouldn't happen, and it's gone, it can't be law. So it's a very straightforward control. Now for councils, you want to talk about the Bylaws Act 2010. And this allows, and a couple of additional reasons the courts can disallow. So this one here is courts, that's Parliament, and this is back to courts. But that one is for regulations here, and this bylaws is only for the council-made bylaws. So in the Bylaws Act 2010, we have section 17. And you can see here the courts may, I'll just do that again, the courts may make a resolution, a bylaw invalid because they're ultra vires, they're unreasonable, which has its common sense meaning of being unreasonable, unacceptable, or it may actually be repugnant to the laws of New Zealand. So if it contradicts a statute. So the laws made by Parliament itself through the Bill to Act process, they are superior to the laws made by delegated legislation, and so the council cannot make a bylaw which contradicts a statute made by Parliament. So those are essentially the main areas we look at here. So let's now go back to what we need to do. You need to talk through this area here. So work through that one, pretty much explaining it. And now we've got to talk to this particular issue, an example of delegated legislation that applies to your business and why it applies to your business. Now, you're going to find this reasonably straightforward to do. So how do we do that? We go to our legislation websites, and let's just go to the home so we clear what we've been looking at, get rid of that. And we have, as we've had all through, our capability of searching. Now, if we go down here for legislative instruments, you're going to find regulations. You can find bylaws for the assignment, but that could be a little bit harder. So my building idea was obviously covering buildings, so I could look for legislative instruments. And I find millions of them. And I can just work through these, look at the various issues, and just find one where I think it's going to be quite simple for me to find an example applying to my plan. Now, a lot of these are about licensed building practitioners. Now here's one that we've actually already talked about, definition of restricted building work. So that's quite an easy one for me. So we have an order, which is statutory regulations. It's an order in council. We've seen this before in the previous video, jury matter pari by order in council. Now down here, we're always going to have pursuant to, which means in pursuance of or under the power of. So that's talking about delegated legislation. So this is where the delegated legislation comes from, section 7 and 402. So let's have a look at those. Okay, so that's the definition section. I'll flick through that and go to the other one. And here we have it. The Governor-General may, by order in council, on a recommendation of the Minister, meaning the Minister of Building, make regulations. So that is the power that's been provided to the Governor-General to make regulations. So I can use that as my example for the assignment. Now if we go back to the regulation, let's just go through and highlight the things we need to talk about in terms of the assignment. So we need to know an example, why it applies. The why is because I come under the Building Act, as discussed earlier, and I'm potentially doing restricted building work, so I need to know what it is. We need to identify the Empowering Act, so we just did that. That was section 4021N of the Building Act 2004. And we need to provide a set of facts which show when this law will apply to your business and the implications. And again, that's pretty straightforward for us here. So we have our regulations, and all I need to be talking about is if I have restricted building work, I'm going to need a licensed builder to do it, or I'm going to have to get the owner to do it under their homeowner exemption. Now, refer back to the earlier video, and that will make much more sense, of course, because we had requirement under the Building Act for a licensed builder for restricted building work, and we have the exemption for building restricted building work under the regulations. So just to summarize, follow this through as I've talked about it with those two pieces of legislation on the controls. You need to give the examples of when delegated legislation occurs, and you can do that for the council, for example, Local Government Act, and find the empowering section as well. Your example, you will find so many examples for any business plan by putting in keywords to do with your business, whether it's food, which will bring up a lot. If you are running a taxi business, you'll find taxi licensing regulations. If you're importing, exporting, just every business that everybody's undertaking that I've heard of is certainly covered by regulations. So you'll have no problem with this section. But do not get too carried away when talking about delegated legislation in this part here. It's about understanding how it applies to business. You do not need to look at delegated legislation relating to offences and fines, although you can as an example. And here's a giraffe to finish the day with.